This is Napoleon. You may know him as he's a pretty interesting guy who got around a bit. If you do know him for any reason, it's probably that one time he casually made Europe his bitch for 12 years. That said, up until this particular point in 1807 during the War of the Fourth Coalition, assuming we pretend Egypt does not exist, he had basically been militarily undefeated since he joined the army. Around this time, he had just got done with dicking down the Prussians at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt and marching into Berlin like he owned the place. He then began chasing what Prussians weren't totally shattered east into East Prussia and occupied Poland to formalize the total annihilation of Prussia as a military threat. The only thing standing in his way at that point was a fuck-huge Russian army that he couldn't seem to completely catch up to. He decided that a winter campaign wouldn't be a fun thing to do because he wasn't stupid, instead choosing to set up camp in Poland and hopefully deal with them when it wasn't cold out. In January, this Russian force under Levin August von Bennigsen elected to try and throw Napoleon for a loop by launching an attack in the winter on the French left flank. Historically speaking, winter attacks seemed to work well for the Russians, so this wasn't entirely unexpected. Napoleon decided to try and make this work to his advantage, regardless of the conditions, and ordered Marshal Bernadotte, the guy in charge of that particular area, to pull back and bait the Russians into a trap, where the bulk of the main army could then rush north and cut off their retreat, which would, in theory, break the Russians and what was left of the Prussians in one fell swoop. However, things would go awry, and the guy delivering the plan was caught by the Russians on a fluke, so Bennigsen did the logical thing and pulled back, likely saving his force in the process. A few rearguard battles would be fought, but the Russians evaded destruction every time. The French were not about to give up though, and gave chase, eventually pissing off Bennigsen enough that he turned around and decided to make his stand with the bulk of his army in the village of Eylau in East Prussia on February 7th. The first French units to hit the battle would be Marshal Soul's 4th Corps and Marshal Murat's cavalry, basically running into the Russian rearguard formation under a certain Peter Bagration around midday on the 7th. They slapped each other around for a bit, but the bulk of the French army began showing up, and Bagration had done his job of slowing them down, so he retreated into the town itself to join with the main force, himself being covered by a rearguard action made by Field Marshal Barclay. What was supposed to be a retreat turned into a brawl for control over the village, which lasted throughout the rest of the day. Eventually, late that night, Bennigsen ordered a retreat and left the village for the French, so he could hopefully have some more time to reorganize his troops and prepare for the next day of battle. Nobody would have the foresight to see the clusterfuck of inhuman proportions that the next day would end up being. The Russians had a strength of roughly 67,000 men plus 9,000 Prussians who were just kind of vibing on the far right of the Russian line at the dawn of the second day. The French, meanwhile, had 45,000 present and another 30,000 coming quickly to reinforce, so the numbers were relatively even. These reinforcements were the two wings of the army, Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps on the right and Marshal Ney's 6th Corps on the left. The plan was to hold the Russians in place by throwing men at the center, while the wings could pull off a pincer, hopefully causing enough chaos to rout them and demolish the Russian army once and for all. Bennigsen's plan, on the other hand, was mostly to make sure the French didn't win too hard, and hopefully do enough damage to get Napoleon to fuck off for a bit. Mother Nature also seemed to have a plan that day, and as dawn rolled around, a not insignificant amount of snow began to dump itself on the battlefield, limiting visibility to a little more than fuck all. The real game would begin when the Russian right would launch an attack at around 9 a.m. in the direction of Eylau, while artillery of both sides traded fire. Seeing this, Napoleon decided to launch his pin attack on the Russian center to take pressure off and make sure the reinforcements would arrive in time. He sent the 7th Corps under the very sick Marshal Agaro, and unfortunately for them, the weather got worse, with many units getting separated from each other and causing the main force to waltz straight in front of the dead center of the Russian line. What resulted was nothing short of a massacre. Walking basically blind into the Russian positions, their artillery chopped them to pieces, followed up by an opportunistic Russian counterattack that obliterated what was left, essentially resulting in the 7th Corps ceasing to exist. This caused a big fucking problem for Napoleon, as his own center was now on the verge of breaking due to these losses. A Russian infantry unit that was chasing the 7th Corps survivors was eviscerated by the Imperial Guard, but this didn't change much. So Napoleon decided to make one big push to try and end this shit show before the Russians could break the center and rout his entire army. So, he called on Marshal Murat and his still massive and relatively unfucked cavalry force to go do what cavalry does best. What follows is one of the great cavalry charges in history. Using the weather to their advantage, the cavalry steamrolled through the unprepared Russians around Eylau and then trounced the troops that had previously butchered the 7th Corps. They then continued onwards, crashing straight through the Russian center and scattering everyone in their path. The gap was further widened by units of the Imperial Guard cavalry. The Russian line had essentially been split cleanly in two, and there was serious risk of a total split of the army, which would have resulted in annihilation. However, Napoleon held most of the guard back as a shit's fucked reserve, as Marshal Ney was nowhere to be found, and neither were the Prussians, which was cause for some concern. The cavalry were finally forced to pull back after their rampage ran out of steam, but the damage had been done and the battle had been saved for the moment. Napoleon had even more good news, as Davout's men had arrived, and began going to work on the Russian left, which was pushed back further and further throughout the day, at serious risk of totally imploding. However, just when it seemed that victory was assured, the Prussians finally showed up. Turns out they had been leading Ney on a wild goose chase, and so hadn't been present for most of the battle, but were causing enough of a ruckus that Ney was still pretty far away, tied up with some smaller Prussian rearguard units. They arrived at the Russian right and circled around their lines, rallying some of the Russian stragglers and cutting around to the left, immediately smashing into Davout's right flank. Before long, it was the French who were falling back. As for Ney, his corps would finally show up at 7 that night and threw themselves at the Russian right, resulting in more bitter fighting till around 10 p.m., when the morale and stamina of both sides finally seemed to give out all at once. By this point, both sides were exhausted, and the battlefield was littered with bodies from what at this point was a day-long slaughter. Bennigsen would be the one to blink first, ordering a quick and surprisingly quiet withdrawal, saving his army from a potential third day of hell. The French did not attempt to pursue them. The body count of the battle was horrific. Russian casualties are estimated to be anywhere between 15 and 25,000, while the French are placed between 15 and 25,000. Both sides would claim victory, but considering the exorbitant loss of life, nobody really won. The French had most importantly failed to decisively destroy the Russian army, essentially making the battle completely pointless. All that was gained was a small village and a frozen field full of corpses. Napoleon would get his victory at Friedland later that year, but this battle had shown that he could, in fact, bleed. This would be the first time Napoleon was fought to a draw by another army, and if a draw could be made, then certainly he could be beaten as well.